Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What are the various types of disabilities affecting literally tens of millions of people around the world? What is the One United Nations agency doing to provide assistance and to help raise the quality of life for these folks? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. There are literally tens of millions of people who are suffering from physical, psychological, and other types of disabilities. Today we're going to take a look at that and see what can be done to provide assistance to these people. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Ms. Akiko Ito. Ms. Akiko Ito is the Chief of the Secretariat for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Ms. Akiko Ito is also a departmental focal point for women at the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, commonly called DESA, of the United Nations. Ms. Akiko Ito, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's talk a little bit. We're going to get into the issue in just a moment. Let's talk a little bit about the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA. Very briefly, what is its main mission? What does it do?
Okay, DESA's main mission is to promote inclusive society and development, and it supports one of the three pillars of the United Nations. As you may know, it's human rights, economic and social progress for a peaceful and prosperous world, and DESA supports that development pillar of the work of the United Nations. This development covers so many, just wide range of issues at the United Nations, so you may have heard about DESA's initiatives in many different fields.
Exactly. Now, I mentioned the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. What exactly is that convention, and what are some of its main provisions?
Yes, convention consists of 50 articles, and the main objective of this convention is to advance the rights of persons with disabilities. They are universal human rights of persons with disabilities. They don't recreate new sets of human rights, but this is about transforming society from that of world which was not very inclusive, but to really to advance inclusion in society and development for all persons. So this is a convention on disability, but at the same time this is a convention for inclusive society development from the disability perspective.
Exactly. Now, how are these conventions adopted? Do you have a certain number of countries that have ratified the convention, that they agree to the provisions, that they want to participate actively in it? And if so, how many?
Yes. Right now, we have 154 states parties that have ratified the convention. Ratify meaning that they have legal obligation to implement this convention. The convention was adopted in 2006, and it entered into force, meaning it came into force in 2008 for those countries that ratify this convention. But because it was adopted by General Assembly, all countries again follow the goals, share the goals and objectives of the convention.
Exactly. Now, do you find, as you mentioned a minute ago, that you referenced being inclusive, and years ago it seems like that a large number of countries, I won't say any particular government or anything, but people in general didn't feel the same way towards people with disabilities. They viewed them differently. They had a different cultural interpretation or psychological interpretation of how they perhaps were not productive members of society, or perhaps erroneously, I'm saying this, a burden on society. Do you find those myths, those stereotypes are breaking down, and that people are looking at people with disabilities as people who have universal human rights and can be productive members of a society?
Yes, I think so. And I think we all start to feel this way. People around us and people who actually discuss disability issues, but people who discuss aging issues, people who discuss youth issues. I think every issue that we talk about, inevitably there's a group of people with disabilities. There's also people with disabilities also are members of society, so they experience their talents are needed for society. And I think this basic fundamental understanding is now becoming part of our knowledge and part of our understanding of how we view, how we work, how we deal with disability issues, and how we view persons with disabilities. For example, there was a major international global conference, UN conference on World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction that took place in this March, and this conference was one of the most inclusive conference that United Nations has ever had in relation to persons with disabilities. The accessibility was ensured by, for example, Nippon Foundation, civil society organizations, and persons with disabilities were active participants in the conference. And the message from the conference was that people with disabilities can be leaders, community leaders, and also beneficiaries in disaster risk reduction. Because, as you said, people have these erroneous ideas that they are people with disabilities are burdens, for example, in disaster risk reduction, because they have to pay more attention to people with disabilities. They have to have special measures, but evidence shows I come from Japan, which is disaster prone, and evidence shows in our country that people with disabilities, with training and with being included in disaster risk reduction training and measures, they can be very effective and proactive participants in disaster risk reduction implementations of these policies. And there were many people with disabilities who saved the communities because they were trained to evacuate from where they lived. So they went back to their house and they said, we have to now evacuate. And then they because of their strong their training, that several communities were saved because of people with disabilities really helping their neighbors. So I think this is one of the examples of how people with disabilities can be leaders, can be change agents.
That's very important. And if you think about natural disasters, we saw that horrific earthquake in Nepal. We've seen the cyclones rip through the Philippines, Hurricane Katrina in the United States, just a variety of natural disasters. And of course, with climate change coming on now and creating even more instability with the natural arrangement of things, that it is so important to focus on disaster risk reduction. And of course, the UN has been a leader in this area, but is it recently that they're involving people with disabilities and thinking more, not just the UN, but I'm talking about everybody, feeling that they're an important part of the solution and that they should not be overlooked?
Yes, I think in this particular, not just this particular conference, but countries like Japan or Philippines or Indonesia, there have been many concrete practice and evidence that disability inclusive disaster risk reduction policies and programs have been in place. Of course, operationalization of it, we still have a lot of work that we have to do. We have to think about how to coordinate among different stakeholders, government, mainstream disaster risk reduction community, disability organizations, and those social workers and families and other community members. We need to develop really good coordination and collaboration to prepare for disaster risk reduction. But like, for example, in the United States, we understand that the government also have been very successful in mainstream disability perspective in federal emergency management programs. So we are now building global network of disability inclusive disaster risk management and programs.
Exactly, yes. And it is so important to be involved in this. Now, of course, our viewers can go to your website at www.un.org/disabilities, or they can even just start typing in, I think, enable, is that?
UN Enable.
UN Enable.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
UN Enable, and it will pop up on the
Yes.
screen. So there are many ways to get the information.
Yes.
Before we go too far, how do you identify the various types of disabilities? I said physical, psychological disabilities. What are the various types of disabilities as you look at people who have a very unique challenge?
Yes, at the United Nations, disability covers all disabilities, whether it's long-term or short-term, from psychological, physical, to any other forms of disabilities. One of the things, for example, like you mentioned World Autism Day, we now have the international community dealing with more wide spectrum of autism, for example, and which means that you cover so many more populations of people with disabilities. And we think about people with disabilities as a group of people who are disabled, but I think over the past several years, there's an international understanding that disability is part of everyone's life. And this was something the UN has been advocating for decades. But I think now that we start to really understand what it means, because, for example, like as an average, if you have 10 people, there are always more than 2 or almost 3 people who may be touched by autism, for example, because it's a wide spectrum. So there are many highly functioning people with autistic conditions who are like genius, who can actually just develop very complex mathematical formula in a few minutes. Somebody who was talented, as to those who perhaps may need some support for their own decision making. So it's a huge wide spectrum of disabilities, and we are somewhere between, or maybe somewhere closer to either side, but it's just how human condition is. It's about human functioning. So it's not about this small group of people who need our support. I think that notion is gone.
Exactly. And you mentioned World Autism Day, and of course I think the UN General Assembly declared April 2nd as World Autism Day. We've read recently about an uptick in the number of, it's usually young boys, as I understand it, who get autism more than perhaps any other group. But at one point I remember reading an article like 1 out of 80, for example, in the United States. Some countries like South Korea may be even higher, I'm not sure. But it seems like now it's like 1 out of every 55. Are we getting closer to figuring out, identifying what the cause of or causes of autism may be? There's a lot of scientific study underway, but are we getting any closer to identifying what some of the causes could be and what some of the solutions might be to help people?
I see. According to our experts, UN experts, because we are not experts on autism, as in our office, but according to our experts, and some findings indicate that there are more findings in relation to how we identify again autistic conditions from much earlier age nowadays, because of advancement in I guess in medical science. We also have a number of like new theories to be able to make early intervention, which have resulted in more empowered individuals who are able to live autonomous lives. So I think that there are a number of good examples, but I am not, and I must say that I'm not a specialist in this field. But what we are trying to do at UN is that we will bring together those experts. For example, we had United Nations expert group meeting three times on specific issues on mental well-being. In relation to disaster risk reduction, in relation to inclusive development, and when those experts come to those expert group meetings, they actually share with us some of the new findings. But at the same time, I think it's important for UN to really to focus on how we can actually promote inclusive society, inclusive communities. Not so much of like scientific evidence, because there are many academic communities and also WHO, World Health Organization, that have a specific focus on autism and other mental well-being issues. So our focus is, as DESA, is more for inclusive participation of persons with mental with autistic conditions or any mental disabilities.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would encourage our viewers to go to www.globalconnectionstelevision.com and take a look at previous shows, look at this show, and also to perhaps make suggestions on future topics and future guests. Today we're taking a look at a large number, literally tens of millions of people around the world who are suffering from various types of disabilities and what can be done to provide assistance. My guest today is an expert on this issue. My guest today is Ms. Akiko Ito. Ms. Akiko Ito is the Chief of the Secretariat for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We're talking about, before we go too far, you may have already mentioned this, I may have just missed it. Do we have an idea, a ballpark figure around the world of how many, I keep saying tens of millions, and I'm assuming it's pretty close, but do we have an idea of how many people suffer from various types of disabilities, be it psychological, physical, sensory, or whatever it may be?
Yes, WHO estimates that 15% of the world population have some forms of disability. And we are now also in a process as DESA to support collection of data and statistics so that we can have more globally comparable data to be able to understand the situation of persons with disabilities in society and development. So right now we use the percentage, 15% of the world population.
15%?
15%.
So that's close to 1 billion people, 900
yes,
million,
yes,
something like
correct.
that.
Yes, yes.
Very close,
yes,
which is a large number
yes.
of people, yes.
Yes,
so we
correct.
could probably safely say that everyone's family is affected. Everyone knows someone, either in the family or perhaps a neighbor or a colleague at work or something like that who has some type of disability.
Yes, I think that's a very important point, because we're not talking about just individuals with disabilities, but those who are touched by disability. You know, if your family member has disability, of course, it affects our lives, and we are very much concerned about how to make sure that our family member again can participate in community and can receive education, can obtain employment. So I think it's an important point. It's not just 15%, but that those who are touched by disability is much bigger in number.
Exactly. Well, the United Nations has been a key player in this for years, going back to, I know, the early 80s and maybe even before that, I'm not too sure, but the General Assembly has declared several various days, International Autism Day, World Health Day, just a variety of other things. But let's bring up, just to look back at some of these days and why they're important. In 1981 was the International Year of the Disabled. Why was that a significant event, and what was the purpose of declaring 1981 as the International Year of the Disabled?
Yes, I think it was a significantly important year in 1981 and 82, those 2 years, simply because the commitment of the UN always existed to promote economic and social progress and human rights and peaceful and prosperous society for all persons. But over, I would say, 60s, we recall that there were a number of instruments on human rights which were developed in those days. So if you look at global discourse on any number of issues, impact of the ongoing work at the time to advance the rights of individuals became very important. So 1970s, there were two declarations. In 70s, Declaration of Mentally Disabled Persons, the Declaration on the Rights of Disabled Persons were adopted, but they were also adapted from the perspective of they were trying to take human rights focus, but then they still have some vestiges from a more welfare approach in those days. So 1980s, come 1980, 81, 82, the United Nations just severed the relationship from that welfare approach and said, people with disabilities, persons with disabilities, it's not persons with disabilities who have to change. It is society that has to change. Society needs to remove all barriers that people with disabilities face, and so that people with disabilities can participate in society. So this was the paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift was enshrined in these 2 years and also International Year of Disabled Persons. And in commemoration of the years, this International Year, the United Nations promoted again, participation of persons with disabilities and their organizations in the activities of the United Nations. So that actually led to a number of international events, such as establishment of Disabled Peoples International, which was the very first organization of persons with disabilities, which became a historical organization that was their people with disabilities, their organization. It's not organizations established by others, but those who had disabilities just established it themselves. And UN actually was a very proud, again, supporter of such network. And so that was 1981. And then the World Program of Action concerning disabled persons was adopted in 1982, which again severed the relationship between the social welfare approach to more the rights-based approach to disability and development. And the human rights dimension had more focus on 1993 through the General Assembly's adoption of the standard rules on equalization of opportunities for persons with disabilities. And that was an instrument that the international community agreed upon to advance human rights. And then in 2001, the international community started to look into an international treaty codifying this commitment and produce an international treaty. And the international community, over the next 6 years, they worked very closely with organization of persons with disabilities, with the UN system, our colleagues, again, our mainstream human rights colleagues, organizations. And the international communities finally adopted the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in December 2006. So I think this is a history of UN supporting again, organization of persons with disabilities, individuals with disabilities who wanted to take the lead, but who were not able to because society placed barriers in front of them. So I think UN has helped these barriers to be removed slowly, and we are still working on that. We have to remove barriers. It's not people with disabilities who need to change, it's society that has to change. And in order for us to do that, we need to remove barriers that the society placed in front of persons with disabilities. That's all that we have to do.
And break down the myths and the stereotypes that
Yes.
have existed and undoubtedly still exist in some areas today.
Yes.
But those are changing very dramatically. Well, we're talking about disabilities, and with the time we have left, it seems like there's been a progression here as far as achievements and accomplishments, but I'm sure that there are also lessons learned. Are there, you mentioned a minute ago how the UN severed this idea of this welfare linkage. Get rid of that because that wasn't really applicable. Are there 2 or 3 major lessons that have been learned over the past 20, 30, 40 years in working with people with disabilities and in acting various conventions and getting folks involved, various groups involved to provide assistance to them?
I think the lesson we learned is to make sure that we listen to, we include persons with disabilities, anything that we talk about in disability. For example, I remember very clearly that during the treaty process from 2001 to 2006, it was a mutual learning experience for 6 years. Member states, policymakers, representatives of different member states who were negotiating the treaty were listening to each other. And when there was a question about disability, then the ad hoc committee that was drafting the convention decided to listen. Just the committee just stopped for a while the official procedure, and there was a discussion on disability. So people with disabilities, individuals with disabilities, and member states and UN system, we all discussed what it means for people with disabilities to pursue, for example, independent living, to be able to live their life, to decide for themselves how they live their lives. For example, so one of the very interesting examples as United Nations was that some representatives were talking about how people with disabilities should be able to live on their own. This is the dignity of persons with disabilities. We have to live on our own. And then those the people with disabilities from developing countries were saying, why do you have to live on your own? Because nobody lives on nobody lives on their own. So for them, especially there was a story of an older woman who was asked, so what do you mean for you to be able to live an independent life in your community? And her answer was that for me to be able to give a birthday party to my grandchildren, and that for me is really giving. It's a very dignified way of life that I can give to other people. So I think as the United Nations, it's wonderful to be able to understand what it means for people to live a dignified life, whether you have a disability or without disabilities. And that universality was something that as the United Nations, we actually try to communicate and try to translate into concrete ideas as to how people can make choices.
Exactly. Ms. Akiko Ito, Chief of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.